Hey, Carl, the biker guy here. I'm in Jacksonville, Florida at the Jacksonville Fire Museum. The original volunteer fire department was started here in 1868. In 1886, they changed over to a paid fire department, partially because of insurance laws. We're going to take a quick walk through the museum and take some pictures, and I'm going to give you a little history about firefighting in Jacksonville, Florida. The alarm system you see here is from the 1930s. It's quite interesting because back in those days, we didn't have the technology we have today, but this is pretty interesting technology because someone would pull an alarm in the building that was on fire. The bells would ring on the outside of the building, and this device here, called an annunciator, would transmit and identify which portion of the building was on fire. The central station would then pick up information from what's being transmitted to it, and a ticker tape would basically punch out in code. The person at the basic ticker tape would have to translate the code, decipher where the fire was, and who to dispatch to the fire. Pretty interesting technology for the 1930s. Behind me is a life net. Now, I know all of you that grew up in the 50s and 60s saw Mickey Mouse being bounced on one of these in the Mickey Mouse Club, but these were actually used in saving people's lives, having them jump out of buildings into the life net. Behind me is a hand pump circa 1806. Now, the first hand pump was actually invented by the Egyptians in the 2nd century. Now, what is amazing is that it was lost, and it was reinvented in the 1500s. Many of the inventions of ancient cultures have had to be reinvented over the years. They did not record some of their inventions. This is one of them. Now, this thing took 8 men to use it, and would fight fire by spraying, the first thing to start spraying water on the fire. Before that, it was bucket brigades. Okay. This may be one of the coolest things in the museum, and this is what they call a pompier ladder. Now, this ladder was invented in France, but it has a St. Louis tie to it. A German visiting France saw these ladders. Now, I'll explain how these ladders will work, but what he did is he brought it back to the United States, landed in St. Louis, and actually St. Louis implemented these ladders in the 1800s. Now, what's neat about these ladders, it's got the big hook at the top, and what they would do is they would crash that hook through a window, pull it down and lock it into place on the window seal, and then climb up. And these little braces would keep the ladder back away from the wall so that they could actually climb up. Now, in many cases, this was used to scale multiple story buildings. And what they would do is then take it and rack it into the next floor and climb up to the next floor, getting up as high as they can to stop the fires and do whatever they needed. The horse-drawn era in Jacksonville was between 1870 and 1921. Now, during that era, horses used to draw the pumper that you see here. This is a steam pumper that was used during that era. Now, there's some really amazing things about that era. First off, the steam pumper you'd fill it with coal, it would create steam, moving the pistons, and then the pistons became pumps to pump water out of either hydrants, ponds, lakes, rivers, and then shoot it through. The second piston would then propel the water to the fire. Now, during the horse-drawn era, there's a lot of interesting things that happened because of the horse-drawn era, like the horses were actually trained to recognize the different alarms and signals. They would actually let themselves out of their stalls and get ready for being hitched to the wagon prior to the firefighters grabbing them. Additionally, this is the era where Dalmatians came into firefighting. Now, the Dalmatians were used, actually, people think they were a decoration. No, they were a working animal at the time. And what they did is they actually chased the horses to help make them go faster. And then once the firefighters were at the fire, what they would do is the Dalmatians would sit and soothe the horses and protect them. protect them from other dogs that might come and bother the horses, or neighborhood kids that would want to get close to the fire wagon. So they actually work. Now, why did they use Dalmatians? Well, because they're very territorial, number one, and number two, their hearing and eyesight is fairly poor because of being inbred so much. Now, what that did is that gave them the ability to not be afraid of the fire and some of the things that were going on around, and just protect the property. I was really dying to slide down this pole, but the curator here is not going to allow me to do it. I don't know what or why, but the way this pole was actually used is the firefighters would twist a towel around it and use the towel as a brake as they slid down the pole. I'm here with Ashley, the curator of this really interesting museum. It's a beautiful place, I love it. Ashley's going to explain to us what happened in the Great Fire of 1901. Ashley?
So it was May 3rd, 1901. It was around lunchtime. At the Cleveland Fiber Factory, they dried out Spanish moss and palmetto leaves to make mattresses and seat cushions. A spark got in there around lunchtime and started the fire. The people who were supposed to be watching the drying Spanish moss, because it is very flammable, were not there. They were lounging in the shade or eating lunch because it wasn't very windy. The spark got in there though. When they noticed the fire, they tried to put it out with buckets of water, but then it caught the factory on fire. So they had to go inside of the factory and get everyone out. A 16-year-old boy down the street saw the fire and he pulled the fire alarm. The fire department showed up within 5 minutes of the fire starting, but were unable to put it out as the factory roof collapsed and blew all the flaming Spanish moss into the air and then down the street. They spread out and tried to keep the fire contained, but the wind picked up from 8 miles an hour to 18 miles an hour, and that is how the fire spread. Fire departments from all over the surrounding area sent special trains up with their firefighters and equipment to try to put out our fire, but for their effort they lost their equipment in our fire. But the fire did burn itself out at Hogan's Creek toward the end of downtown, and that's how the fire got out. It was not put out. There were 7 fatalities in the fire, over 2,000 buildings destroyed, 140 city blocks destroyed, and the fire burned in 8 hours.
Say that again. How many buildings?
Over 2,000.
2,000 buildings and how many square blocks?
140 blocks.
I mean, that was basically the city, wasn't it?
It was. About a third of the city was destroyed. 10,000 people out of the 30,000 who lived here were homeless. But Jacksonville really pulled together after that, kind of like Missouri after a tornado or flooding. They really pulled together, and people, if you had a building or a house, you had people living inside your house with you. You might have 30 or 40 people staying on your property. Kids had to sleep out in the yard, and the adults would sleep on the porches and inside the house. And it was May in Jacksonville. May in Jacksonville is pretty warm, so they were all right doing that. But then the federal government sent aid down. They sent tents down and cots, and people lived in tent cities. Different cities around the country sent aid as well, with their newspapermen to get the good story and the photos they wanted. But they also sent aid and kind of helped Jacksonville pull together.
Interesting. Now, you talked about 7 fatalities, but you said that that's really probably not all of them.
That probably is not the case. There were probably more people who died in the fire, but they only counted the bodies they found. There were people trapped along the edge of the river that couldn't get out, and most people could not swim.
So a lot of them drowned?
They probably drowned or died of smoke inhalation and fell in the river and were probably swept downstream.
Oh my God. That's absolutely horrible. The diorama is kind of amazing to see, just how much devastation that took place here. But the Great Fire of 1901 in Jacksonville, Florida.